Amazing. Okay, so, all right. Well, hi, everyone. My name is Hannah, and today I'll be talking about my topic of my presentation, which is non-musical game spaces. So we're expanding fantastical spaces through ludomusicology, spatiality, and soundscapes. And so this presentation will discuss what I call a non-musical video game, which I will be using Sea of Solitude to understand that video games can rely on music to develop game spaces. And so Sea of Solitude will specifically be utilized to gauge that overlap between ludomusicology space and soundscapes to discuss like my three main points, which is going to be talking about environment and narrative and absorb spaces. You can click the next slide for me, please. So to begin, I kind of want to provide some working definitions. I would like to first state that the concept of like space and place is obviously varied throughout history, especially when you're talking about geography or social sciences or anthropology and more. It also is really dependent on the scholar's perspective. And so because of the varying understandings of space by itself, I really only want to provide like really basic understandings of these, because also for the time of the presentation. So in the most basic sense, space concerns like where things are and where they can happen, and especially about where they are in relation to others. This definition, like many others like it concerning space, consider more of like cardiological and geographical senses when writing about space. And it's essentially prevalent in video game studies, especially with open world RPGs, when they're maps when discussing like space and place. And so my next definition is going to be ludomusicology, which is a term popularized in 2013 by Roger Mausoley, which is largely informed by its relationship between video games and engaging with music inside of it. The word's just really long. And lastly, so soundscapes are the entirety of sounds perceived in a given context. So soundscapes are when you use sound and music to create the atmosphere of a story to being told. And so these sounds can be background noises, sound effects, or musical instruments and sounds like what is happening. So with all that said, I intend to move beyond kind of some such considerations when it comes to space studies in general to include ludomusicology and soundscapes. And I really want to use kind of the image that you see on the text, which is Robert Talley's spatial literary studies and his connection to that, which allows scholars to reflect upon representations of space and place, whether in the real world or in imaginary universes, or in the hybrid zones where fiction can meet reality. I look to create and develop a hybrid zone with these three, with his usage of that kind of connection. And then next slide, please. So the really big question is like, why these three? So first, there's like very little academic research on these overlap, even though we have numerous amounts of research in other groupings. So we have research concerning like music and space, and we have music and research concerning like space and video games, but we don't have anything that like intermingles the three, where you have music, space, and video games. And as mentioned prior, since spatial literary studies is already interested in the relationship between it and music, so why not add the exact medium, video games, and that these two can interact with? So one might also take the argument, like is on the screen, that KJ Donnelly does, that video games are based on spatial exploration and engaging with both audio and visual movement and stasis. Ultimately, I wish to examine video games that are not quote unquote inherently musical. But first, I really need to talk about like what makes the game musical. And the next slide, please. So to begin, I'd really like to say that music and everything that that word encompasses is very subjective. And I do want to make clear that the subjectivity of this is very important, as gaming experiences also are very subjective for everybody. So for me personally, I have 20 years of musical experience. And so from some of which is actually a bachelor's degree in music. So for me, music is always and will be an important aspect of my gaming experience. Additionally, these types of differences in games are important to notice, especially when considering how games are developed and who they're made for. So how can we define musical game? So how we define a musical game is difficult, and much like the definition of space, there really is like no concrete answer. So when drawing the line for what makes a game musical or non-musical, the games on the screen I provide are ones I would categorize as musical ones where the plot is tied to music, or music is or has tied to like a musical device, or ones where the music is used within the story itself, Or lastly, music is used like an audible indicator when you like with clues and or completions and more that are useful for your plot or your movement forward in your game. So these types of games, game scholars, especially ludomusicologists, are really examine these types of games because they have very integrated music inside of them, especially in the cases of like, for example, Journey, because of the notoriety of the soundtrack and its integration into the game. And then next slide, please. On the opposite side, games like these on the slide entered into a category of what I call non-inherently or non-musical games. Games that have soundtracks, and they have soundscapes, and they have sound effects and more, but the plot is not altered due to the music. And nor does the music typically integrate itself with sound effects that provide clues or indications or like actively playing. It's just background typically. So these like types of games, we hear acknowledge these music and sounds and all of that, but it's not typically at the forefront and integrated into our gaming experience. There are also the types of games that scholars typically ignore when analyzing, especially in why I'll be focusing on the presentation of at least one of these types of game, which is up on the screen. I want to demonstrate that fantastical spaces in video games are worthy of analyzation beyond the status quo of what is studied in academia, especially especially considering these three aspects of what I want to talk about, which is environment, narrative, and absorption, in the intersection of ludomusicology and space and soundscapes. And so with that, I want to take you to my main case study, which is on my next slide, please. So Sea of Solitude is a third-person point of view released in 2019 that earned nominations at the Game Award, that got Games of Impact and winning the most significant impact of games for 2020 as well. So there's also release of a director's cut in 2021 with a refined script and new voice work and new gameplay. The game follows like a young woman named Kay, who is suffering from such strong loneliness that her inner feelings, so the darkness, the anger, the feelings of worthlessness and hopelessness, turn into the outside and she becomes a literal monster. And the game is about finding out why this happened and to her and how to turn her back into a human. So on this journey, she's confronted with monsters that are like grotesque representations of her own self, her father, her mother, her brother, and her boyfriend. Besides her own self and her family, these monsters and more are also depict like self-destruction, depression, self-doubt, social pressure, and more as they interact with her throughout the story. While the game is based in a place of Berlin, which is the creative director Cornelia Gebhardt's hometown, I want to identify that Kay is not exploring a real world. She is exploring a fantastical dream space where she is constantly confronted with her past and that mirrors some places for her and her family's lives. Place can and should be analyzed within this game, but for the context of this presentation, I will only be focusing on space. Sea of Solitude is also not notable in its exploration for space, place, or music. It's a short 2 to 4 hour game, and it's a really decently linear path and literally little exploration besides like achievements. And unlike Legend of Zelda series, which is notably analyzed by scholars because of its musical qualities, I believe that music has the power to impact space, even if it is part of the background. Because, like my definition I provided earlier, just as space provides where things are in relation to others, music also accomplishes this as well. So with that, we're going to talk to my first category, which is environment, which is on the next slide, please. So when we analyze environments in video games, we often think about their connection to the real world or to real places. So like the connections to America of Last of Us and Horizon Zero Dawn series depicting like literal versions of America, just, aged. However, like game environments can also lean into cliched landscapes. So not I specifying its reference or creating a landscape that would not make sense for its location. So if, for example, the swamps of Horizon are in states where there would not be swamps. Such environments may give players the disorienting sense that this could be anywhere but nowhere at all. And this isn't specifically a negative analysis, as fantastical fictions often compare our world to imaginary ones, often through metaphors. However, like mentioned prior, I do want to make the distinction that this world that K occupies is not real, and even with the indications that it could be a cityscape. With that being said, music's impact to the space that it creates a powerful accompaniment for environments. And just as spatiality is too large of a topic to really be summarized into one definition, so was music. Music, or if we get even more specific, soundscapes can include an impact and include diegetic sounds, which occur with from sources with inside the game world. So K's like footsteps and the rain that you hear, or something that Kay would hear herself, or non-diegetic sounds, or sounds that are outside of the game world that we as players experience, which is like your soundtracks. So while the game is full of these examples, I do want to really like hone into a specific example, which is actually on my next slide. And I'd really like to we're going to watch a video. Essentially, I really like you to focus on is the sounds and the music within the game. And I want you to talk about, sorry, I want you to really listen to focusing on the three different kind of spaces and places that Kay occupies, which is going to be the boat, the buildings, and then the dark waters. And then you can play the YouTube video, please. And it should auto stop by itself as well.
Okay, great. What I'm going to do is I think I'm going to have to stop sharing and then start again, just because I don't think I originally said to share sound.
No,
So
that's
I'll
okay.
do that now.
That sounds perfect. I should have specified. I'm so sorry.
It's okay. Is that okay?
Yeah. And you can pause it.
Great.
Thank you. Sometimes it's auto stop, sometimes it doesn't. So, and you can just leave it there. There's no slide change for now. So in the video, Kay occupies multiple spaces within the game world, musically at least. So here, Kay is met with our first monster, which is an image of her own self-destruction lurking in the waters below. So in this scene specifically, the music relies heavily upon the environment or space that Kay occupies. So we have like a silent softness from the boat originally, which is met with comfort and none of the diegetic sounds of the rain that then is into the next setting, which is the building. So they're also silent, but the diegetic sounds make the space feel differently as well. So you have highlighting her loneliness and the darkness of the situation as well. So you have the rain, the lightning, and the waves, her wet footsteps echoing on the walls, all of which Cornelia herself has said are metaphors as well. And the game also utilizes silence really well to make the player feel spatially constrained. Even with Kay not being in a physical building, although she is later in the stories, her footsteps reverberate through the empty walls of some of these buildings. And then lastly, we have the water. And the space combines both diegetic and non-diegetic sounds as the music from the soundtrack pulls the player in and feels the pressure of being eaten alive by Kay's self-destruction on top of the diegetic sounds of the water and then the monsters, chasing after you. The space for Kay and the players is dangerous as the music intensifies and the space intensifies, at least musically as well. And then we'll go to our next one. Our next slide, please. So the next thing I want to talk about is narrative. So C.S. Solitude's music impacts the emotional value of her story as well because of the spaces that she occupies musically. So emotional stories like Kay's require powerful signifiers, both with music and space, to heighten the complexity of the world that Kay occupies. So a fantastical sunken Berlin. And by creating musical signposts and more, music provides motivation to a player to reinforce meaning. So first, Sea of Solitude creates a complex harmonization between the three-dimensional game space itself and the third-person perspective through music to heighten the drama between the physical places and spaces that Kay occupies and the narrative of the story. For example, from the YouTube clip, Guy Jackson, the composer of Sea of Solitude, utilized the capabilities of the game's soundscape with increased tension for the water by adding in the non-diegetic sounds that we talked about earlier. This might just at a basic layer just seem like an environmental aspect, but again, we are also talking about mental health issues, and the music does impact the chase of mental health issues, attacking Kay and herself. So it also emphasizes Kay's whole overall narrative arc in the game as well. And second, another signifier that's really interesting about Sea of Solitude is that in the game there are 12 main chapters for the game, and they all relate to issues within that chapter of the game, and they're also being told in the name of like famous songs. Chapter 3 I'd really like to focus on, which is The Sound of Silence, which is the name of the chapter, but is also a song by Simon and Garfunkel. And this is a reference to the part in the narrative of Kay's brother, which is Sunny. And the phase of The Sound of Silence can be compared to the more common phrase of turning a deaf ear, just as Kay does narratively with Sunny as she relives him being bullied at school, and while she turned a deaf ear to his struggles and did nothing to be able to really like assist him. And these musical signposts can create layers between the real and the fantastic through the game's space and the player's space and how they interact with the narrative both musically and spatially. And then lastly, I'd like to go to, oh no, not lastly. And then lastly, there's another section for the narrative, which is on my next slide, which is talking about Sea of Solitude and space as metaphor. So mental health issues can seem overwhelming and difficult to depict, and Sea of Solitude, the narrative, creates space of the mind and our perceptual experiences of mental health. And we're seeing these through the layers of metaphors, the largest one being the monsters themselves. And the monsters in Sea of Solitude's narrative represent both physical and metaphorical devices for Kay's mental health and narrative. Boss battles in Sea of Solitude are not really conventional fights. Rather than fighting enemies, you help overcome issues by clearing corruptions, as seen in the bottom left hand corner. And the black tentacles that are sucked into Kay's backpack that she wears throughout the game, making the backpack both a physical and metaphorical representation of like the emotional baggage that one can carry. Ending these corruptions also increases Kay's understanding of other people's problems throughout the narrative itself, but it also does pain her. It actually physically hurts her within the game as well, because it makes her feel sick, and she does scream as well a few times. And it gives kind of also the type of narrative of fighting off your demons as a painful experience. So both the monsters and the corruptions that Kay is burdened with to an extent in spaces beyond like the physical places and spaces of Berlin and what we would think of as like a narrative and an environment. And they also burden, her space of mind. So to help emphasize these characters, Guy Jackson which is the composer, attempted to have specific spaces in the game to engage with musical themes or leitmotifs that would gradually build into the scene to like set a tone, which is, he created, developed soundscapes and not just thrust a gamer into a scene. These moments of high emotional value were considered 3D cues for navigation through surround sound and more easily like a musical GPS, if you will. And then lastly, I do want to talk about kind of like the last section and piece that kind of puts narrative and, which is in my next slide, narrative and immersion, narrative and environment together, which is absorb fantasy spaces. The degree of immersiveness that we experience in fantastical texts, like video games, can establish a transgression of parameters that govern a player's idea of reality. So, in other words, one can alter the immersive, quality of a video game when mimetic and semiotic perspectives, and when you're experiencing both at the same time, especially when you're accepting them as they are. So, what does this mean in terms of like Sea of Solitude and about real life struggles and music? So we want to move like beyond the metaphor of like immersion, because that never is really enough of a word sometimes to express how we feel in games. And so I really like to use Mark Wolf's definition of absorption, which is a two-way process, like you see on my slide. It says the audience's attention and imagination is absorbed or pulled into the world, and at the same time, the audience also absorbs the imaginary world as well. Thus, one is able to mentally leave or block out one's physical surrounding to some degree. He also describes how world makers actively use these processes to enhance the experience of a world, um, increasing the illusion of an audience's completeness or consistency when it comes to fantastic worlds. Um, I wish to add on to like Wolf's definition and understanding of absorption, adding in the musical aspect into these spaces because research on spaces in video games and music is often omitted. And when we're only focusing on visible spaces that we typically see, we're literally leaving out a whole section of how space can function in academia. Kay's world, not necessarily specifically musical, in the aspects of games like Crypt of the Necrodancer or Figment or Legend of Zelda, it's music and sound design and soundscapes that are created create spaces for Kay to explore and experience, not only allowing the player to absorb Kay's world, but also for her as well. Music has the power to absorb its players and it's as much as environments and narratives do as well. I'm going to go to the next slide, please. So, in creating musical spaces that can modulate the game and considering the importance of games for their players, elements of the everyday life, video game music can give room for the recovery of the enormous role that it plays in people's lives. So, a role that more alleged, sophisticated forms of scholarship often, get neglected and forgotten. Fantastical role building in video games involving soundscapes and ludomusicology and spatial qualities of game spaces can help adapt world building scholarship as well, creating complex spaces that allow a multitude of logical or even contradictory outcomes, such as virtual space, as in fact being able to incorporate the consumer's delight as much as like the details of an actual world. So fantasy in video games is like really interactive, adopts various domains, inviting players to involve themselves. And I really do think that music really needs to be embellished and added into that talk, into that conversation. We can't simply determine one effect upon a listener because music is so subjective and it creates a space of negotiation and interaction with and play with humans. It also, and just like music creates dimensions and entities in games and texts, so does the broader world. And so, in the end, Sea of Solitude surpasses what space and music can provide individually, and it empowers a player to absorb a story world that is beyond their own. It reveals not only the importance of music and gameplay, and its spaces, but also the play in ludomusicology. Thank you.